All right, everyone, and welcome to the Liam McCullum Show. We are doing an in-person podcast for the first time. I've got Ethan Holmes with me again. I had him on my previous interview, the last interview I did 2 weeks ago, talking about the events that are transpiring in Russia and the United States response to it. And we're kind of just going to do a recap and an update to the developments that are going on. I also have my guest co-host, Spencer Whitaker, on with me tonight. Really great friend, and most of my political conversations happen with him, so I figured it would be awesome to bring him on and kind of have more of a conversation tonight than my usual interviews, which are typically just me on Zoom with someone and kind of interrogating them. So Ethan, just to kind of like recap from our last interview, do you want to kind of just start, I guess, like start where you think is going on and just recap what we talked about in the previous podcast, like the buildup, the military operations, and everything like that?
Yeah, of course. And of course, obligatory thank you for having me back on the podcast. I know it's sooner than expected, but developments happened sooner than expected. So alas, here we are. I also appreciate the freedom to start where I want, because I know this is like a big situation. It's a lot to digest, right? And so I'm going to try and piecemeal it here together. So try and follow along the strings here. So for the past really several months, since late 2021 here in early 2022, Russia built up a large amount of forces on its western border with Ukraine. Well over 100,000 troops, greater than 150,000 troops even, I believe, at its peak nowadays. And it sparked a whole greater European security crisis, and particularly a security crisis for the state of Ukraine. So how did we end up in this big standoff situation? Well, that's a really, really long and complicated story, but let's just try and bring it back just in these last couple months. So we have a standoff between Russia and we have Ukraine. Now, a lot of people look at Ukraine and wonder why Russia would be picking on someone so much seemingly smaller than themselves. They're geographically smaller, their population is less, they have a smaller economy. And so it really appears to be at least major regional power bullying a much smaller state on the continent. However, the reason why it's a complicated standoff and a battleground between Russia and the West is because the West backs Ukraine. The West has democratic aspirations for Ukraine. They'd like the people to be able to elect the leaders they want to, have the future they want to, determine whether they join organizations like NATO, whether they want to be part of Russia again, which doesn't seem to be the popular consensus in many places in the country. And so the West has sent money. They've sent particularly defensive aid and arms to Ukraine. And that really, really worries Russia, because the more that Ukraine enters the Western sphere of influence, the less it's in the Russian regional sphere of influence. And over the past several decades, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian sphere of influence has been slowly chipped away by organizations like NATO in the West, this kind of Atlantic sphere. The reason why NATO is at the center of all this, why that's kind of a recurring buzzword here, is because NATO membership would kind of be the last stride, kind of be the nail in the coffin for much of Russia's ambitions in the eastern part of Europe, on the Eurasian continent generally. And they feel as though they were promised that NATO expansion would occur in Eastern Europe. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was negotiations on how to handle the whole dissolution of what was the world's second superpower. We went from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, the so-called end of history, as Francis Fukuyama would put it. And if you could show Fukuyama today, he never would have written the end of history whatsoever. But we went from a bipolar to a unipolar world, and this Western sphere was very heavily involved in how the Soviet Union broke up. And several very consequential decisions came out of that, namely the geography of Ukraine proper, which included pretty much all the territory it was given at various points in Soviet history by different Soviet leaders. But a major point is that Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons which were kept in Ukraine, and a large part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was kept in Ukraine, in exchange for protection. They said, we'll give up our nukes so that there's not just a random smaller tier country around with nukes. But in exchange, we expect to have defense taken care of for us. If we're going to give up the biggest defensive tool a country can possibly have, we need some guarantees. And so you see where that guarantee today, that promise to defend Ukraine's right as a sovereign nation and to defend what it's given in this post-Soviet era, to try and make something better out of it in the Western Enlightenment sense. That comes into conflict with the promise seemingly made to Russia to not expand NATO influence further and further towards their border. And so the standoff really brought to light these deeper tensions, these unresolved conflicts really that have been there for a while, but haven't yet boiled over until seemingly this very point. And so, of course, recently, and I'm sure we'll deep dive into this as well, we've gone from that buildup to now a full-scale military operation taking place across Ukraine, missile strikes, troop movements. We see aerial activity, of course, all sorts of modern warfare taking place across Ukraine. That probably here immediately, but that's the 30,000-foot view. I hope, despite being a little rambling all over the place, that really sets us up for why the buildup and now this military operation is so important, and how this conflict between the West backing Ukrainian security and defense and sovereignty, and Russia trying to maintain its post-Soviet sphere of influence as a diminishing regional power, how that tension is really at the core of this whole thing.
Yeah, so last night when I was just kind of watching what was happening on Twitter, I was talking to my friend Rick Coverdale about this today, how it really, the last time I felt this way was when the United States killed Soleimani, where it was like this event where we had no idea what was going on. There were rumors that, at the time in Iran with that assassination, shortly after Iran's response, there was kind of this question of whether or not the UAE had taken off and there were jets in the sky, and it was just like no one knew what was happening. So now that we're kind of 24 hours from that, from what happened, I wonder if we can just kind of go through exactly what happened, because instantly people were calling it they were calling it full-scale war. It was World War III, and now it seems it was very limited. We didn't really know at the time what was happening, but it seems like there really is a strategy here that we've talked about personally. So do you just want to break down what Putin and Russia did last night?
Yes, so let's actually take this slightly further back from just last night to, let's say, Sunday, Monday. I believe it was Monday on President's Day. Putin announced that he was going to formally recognize the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Now, these are those breakaway, self-declared autonomous regions in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass region. So Donbass is short for Donetsk Basin. It's a very resource-rich area of Ukraine. It's dominated by Russian speakers. There's a large Russian ethnic population there as well. And so that's why they feel this affinity more so towards Russia in a large chunk of the population, as opposed to the Ukrainian state. So Putin formally recognizes these breakaway republics as legitimate, autonomous political entities. And that really starts a snowball of what's resulted to this day.
Really quick on that, I'm wondering, so these regions actually, did they hold a plebiscite? They actually voted to separate themselves because they are kind of more pro-Russian. What is exactly kind of like the background there? Why did Putin feel comfortable declaring these countries or these regions independent?
That's a good question. It really was, in many senses, it seems, a long time coming. They were already de facto recognized and supported by Russia in many senses, but it's the formality of it in the global stage that was really of concern. So the situation with those areas really escalated and started in 2014, 2015 there, along with the integration of Crimea back into the Russian Federation. You saw strong pro-Russian separatist sentiment across the country. You had the revolutions, the regime changes going on in Ukraine at the time, from a relatively Russian-friendly regime to one much more friendly towards the West and towards NATO. And that's really what, once again, revealed some of these underlying tensions in how Ukraine and Russia reformed and how they relate in this post-Soviet sphere. And it's something, it shouldn't be a controversial admission at all. We can recognize, I think, very clearly in the post-colonial world in Africa and Asia, we drew very imperfect borders, which led to lasting conflicts due to imperfections in the political resettlements and renegotiations of territories, right? And the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the dissolution of an empire, frankly. It's very, very similar in that sense. So to recognize that perhaps in the reformation of these post-Soviet states, there were some things that in the long term are going to boil up. That's not outside of the realm of possibility, I think, at all. It shouldn't be an admission that's controversial just to say that maybe these lines weren't drawn perfectly, or at least they were drawn in a way that we now have to account for now and address in the present day, even if there was no way maybe we could have seen in hindsight that something. There should have been a fair bit of foresight upon the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I think we're going to get into kind of world power dynamics, but that's a long-winded way to answer your question about Donetsk and Luhansk. It goes really back to 2014. It really is just de facto to de jure now in the recognition of them as autonomous political entities with their own leadership, diplomatic, relations with the Russian Federation.
Mm. And to tap you in, were you following this as it happened, and did you have any? I guess what were your thoughts as it was happening? I wasn't really talking with you during all of these events and as it was transpiring.
Yes. So obviously, coming from a more Western-centric perspective, I'm not as very involved nearly or as up to date on those things, and so it's much more. My perspective then is, what is my country doing? Like how is this? And not necessarily selfish, but how does this affect me? But it's more so how are my worldviews shifting, and how are my perspectives being challenged by the events coming here? And it's an interesting situation to see because, like Ethan was saying, it seems to be the result of many past mistakes made by various regimes, both on the Soviet side, both on our side, both on the whole reformation of those states from that empire, and then also in the foreign affairs between the United States and the Russian group, since the early 1990s when all this was going on. It's only been 30 or 40 years since Ukraine has been recognized as that, and in that time there's been different arguments around a lot of these states. And the interesting thing is now we're sitting here after the actions kind of come to a head last night, and it's looking back, and there's so many different things you can point to say, oh, this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong, they made this mistake, we didn't draw the lines correctly, so we don't understand the ethnic variabilities within these regions. But it's now okay, well, what now? How then do we resolve these things? Do we resolve these through military action? Do we let these ethnically Russian areas that are wanting to have separatist sentiments, where does the sovereignty lie in these situations? Does it lie with these these countries that were created from the dissolution of the Soviet Union? Does it lie with the country Russia, where they originated? Does it lie with the people individually in the Donbass region? If they want to be part of Russia, then my initial sentiment is, okay, let them be part of Russia. That's it's kind of a self-determination kind of aspect. And then circling all the way back to where I come from, just as more or less your average American following along to these from various news sources, is what role have we played? And then now, obviously all these mistakes have happened, we need to learn from them. So going forward, what there's a question of what right do we as individuals or as a country have to interfere in any of these things. And there's also the question of okay, we need to not be making more mistakes. You can compound this mistake with a bigger mistake, because you could lead to all these talk of World War III and this and that. Some of it's true, some of it's false, some of it's alarmism. But mistakes that we didn't even think we were making 30 or 40 years ago, are now all of a sudden, thousands of people are dying as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, the interesting point about the sovereignty there is just this idea that, like, often what I hear from people who are kind of defending Ukraine is that we are protecting, or we should protect, their territorial integrity and their sovereignty. And this is a sovereign nation that should be defended, and it has its own interest. And that really is kind of like made more complicated when you put it into perspective with what happened in 2014 with the coup, and also with this region declaring itself kind of more pro-Russia, and then not necessarily wanting to associate with the government that was established in 2014. So
you and
wondering if
Spencer have both hit on the key point here, and that's this tension around our seemingly Western Enlightenment value of national self-determination, the right for people to decide who their government is, and our interests as a leading geopolitical entity on the world stage, who sometimes this right to national self-determination may conflict with, or the processes of determining which we might disagree with. So it really, there's a big conversation to be had, and I hope we have it, about what this whole situation around Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the West is meaning for the world stage more broadly. What does this mean for the seeming end of history that was predicted? Is this truly a pivotal moment from a unipolar world order to something much less certain?
Do you want to break down kind of just like what you mean, or what was meant by end of history, kind of like what the history is there?
I'd love to sort of back to that, but I did want to finish from like the events of the last couple of days.
Yes, go ahead.
Just so we don't like lose that track here. So
it's very important.
Yes,
very important to what's going on.
So Putin essentially recognizes the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, and in response, the West rolls out its kind of first rounds of sanctions and other economic measures, defense measures. And one of the important things is that they call a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, which Russia happens to be the chair of, which will be of note here. And so the UN Security Council is meeting here. The U.S. Had announced, in response to the decision by Putin to recognize these republics, had announced a series of sanctions. They essentially shut down any opportunity for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany to go online. They kind of said that project is now, I think they said it's a hunk of steel laying at the bottom of the sea. And so while the UN Security Council is meeting about this, Russian President Vladimir Putin goes on air and starts delivering a speech about this whole situation, in which he says that in order to protect Russians living in eastern Ukraine, to prevent genocide, or if he's going to be more accurate, I would say democide might be what he really means in that region. And he vowed to denazify Ukraine and to demilitarize Ukraine. And we can kind of get into what those both mean respectively as pretty specific verbiage in this situation. But he delivers that address, and he also delivers lots of points of perspective from his administration about why they are so interested in Ukraine. He goes deep into their history, the perspectives on how Russia views Ukraine, at least from Putin and maybe the Kremlin more broadly, their view. And they also, of note, announced a special military operation in Donetsk and Luhansk to assure their sovereignty that they had just recognized as breakaway nations, and also just respond to any potential Ukrainian activity in the region to protect the Russians that Putin was talking about, purportedly being persecuted by the Ukrainian government for, let's say, purportedly being Russian. And we also see then not just military operations in the Donbass, though, in those regions. That's kind of what caught people off guard, is instead of just having a peacekeeping operation, as Putin referred to it, there in those eastern regions, we saw a series of strikes all across Ukraine. These strikes largely targeted air bases, other pieces of military infrastructure, communications infrastructure, trying to take out their Navy, their Air Force, their ability to act as a military very, very quickly. It's not an unexpected military maneuver, but it was unexpected at the time, because once again, Putin had only seemingly announced a special military operation, peacekeeping operation in those regions that he had just recognized. So that occurs as the UN Security Council is meeting, and the meeting kind of goes to hell. The Ukrainian envoy there to the Security Council, to the UN, gets in a spat with the Russian envoy Nebenzia to the UN, who is chairing this UN Security Council meeting, where pretty much roundly most of the other Western nations are condemning the actions and expressing outrage over what they're getting from reports coming in from Ukraine. And Nebenzia, holds the standard Russian line on the Russian perspective on why they're engaging in the operations that they are. And that kind of leads us to where we are now today, where over our night in the United States and over the day there in Ukraine, we saw a wide array of military operations. Once again, they seem to be relatively targeted in scope. It's not like there's just massive, blitzkrieg tank and rank and file soldiers following behind, rolling in everywhere. It does seem to be a lot of aerial activity, lots of missile strikes and other kind of lengthy military jabs, so to speak, to important infrastructure. But of course, that can all change. That could be changing right now as we speak, and we're just not aware. But that's kind of, once again, in a nutshell, what's happened over the last couple of days. Putin recognizes these breakaway republics. The West launches a first round of kind of like these initial light-handed, slap on the wrist sanctions. Putin, for whatever reason, makes the call then, whether it's because it's a sunk cost kind of thing, or because he truly feels he has nothing to lose at this point, or he didn't respect the Russian response, perhaps, and he launched the greater military operation across Ukraine. And as neutral as I can, that's the situation we are in at the present moment. Reports continue to come in about various sanctions in response from Western entities now. So we go from Russian buildup, Russian recognition, Western sanctions, Russian military operations, more Western sanctions now. And so we're going to see whether sanctions and statements are greater than sticks and stones, but only one of them breaks the bones of the people seen by their logic and rhetoric invading a sovereign country. But the U.S. has vowed, the Biden administration has vowed, U.S. troops will not be in Ukraine fighting Russian soldiers, and that they're only going to act defensively in NATO allied countries.
So do you take anything away from the fact that Putin decided right now to take these regions or to declare these regions independent? Is there anything that changed? What was the pretext? Is it, I know that we weren't having any diplomatic talks with them while we were accusing them of invading any day. We were saying that they were going to invade. We set deadlines for it, really. We said it's going to happen on Wednesday. They actually set dates for it, which I found strange. And then the days came and went. And then apparently, from what I was reading, we weren't actually meeting with Putin and discussing at the time. So do you think that the fact that we weren't having any diplomatic talks, or what do you think kind of triggered this? And I know you don't really like to read into Putin's mind, but can you at least do you have any thoughts as to what may have happened?
Yeah, well, a couple points there. You're right. I don't like to engage in mind reading, especially like criminologists into Putin's mind reading. It's just I don't consider it a great use of my time, and it's usually speculation at best. One thing to note though is diplomatic discussions, at least on the surface, were going on. We've been engaged in a series of discussions through ambassadors and various forums and formats with the Russians, with the Ukrainians, and with the European continent writ large. And as the State Department, I believe, put it, it was all kabuki theater on Russia's part, and they were allegedly only playing the parts of diplomacy, so to speak, going through the motions with no real intention. Now, Russia did very notably start out this whole thing early on by giving a pretty clear list of European security proposals, things that they wanted to see discussed and taken, have action taken on the continent that they thought would contribute to their security, geopolitical stability, etc. the West openly said that most of it are non-starters, is the word that they use. They're non-starters, they're not going to go anywhere. There were some limited areas where they did recognize there could be further cooperation, I believe in like, missile arms control kind of realm stuff. But in terms of Russian proposals like affirming that Ukraine would join NATO, the West absolutely refused to get into. NATO was very firm in its resolve about having an open door policy that any country who meets the prerequisite requirements and wants to join NATO can join NATO. So, if the other members approve, of course. And so having the diplomatic discussions break down is what it seems more like to me. Is you can say that the attempt wasn't sincere, there was no authenticity in the Russian attempt to engage in diplomacy, but there were certainly, at least on the surface, diplomatic discussions and engagement with pretty clear ideas in mind. Once again, you could argue they knew that the West was going to say most of them were non-starters and that it was totally not possible, but there was, at least on the surface, a diplomatic effort. Now, those did obviously break down. The U.S. is now saying that Biden is certainly not going to meet with Putin. Blinken, our Secretary of State, is not going to meet with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister's counterpart, until de-escalatory actions are taken. So we have taken a step back from high-level diplomacy, but the U.S. does continue to reiterate that diplomacy is still on the table. There is still a diplomatic path. It's just much, much more difficult now, given that they have now imposed a sweeping array of sanctions, as they would call it, unprecedented array of sanctions, and Russia operations there in Ukraine. So, interesting situation.
Yeah, so we might end up having some unstable Wi-Fi every once in a while, but I think I don't know, we've had some strange connection over the last couple of days, but it cuts out and then all of a sudden it comes back in. So hopefully you guys aren't missing too much. But I'm wondering, Spence, if you just if you have any questions for Ethan or kind of what you think of everything and just from what your perspective is, because I mean, like I've talked with Ethan about this before, so I feel like I kind of know where he's going with things, so it's hard for me to kind of look at it from a more objective and bird's eye view. So I'm wondering what you think about
it. So I have two questions, and the first one is about the sanctions, because obviously coming from a kind of a purely American Western perspective, it's like what is being done on our half. So when you talk about these sanctions that are being levied against Russia, are these economic? Are these like akin to a blockade? Are these against their trade with other countries? Like what does it impact them as a nation, and then how does it impact their citizens?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I should have been more detailed, but I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to be more detailed. They hit the financial sector is one area, so they're cutting off the ability for large Russian banks, think VTB and Sberbank and the like, which are very large Russian financial institutions.
Would be akin to
it's like Wells Fargo and whatever. And so those have restrictions being placed on them right now, which I think they said it's like $1 trillion worth of the Russian economy is like within these banks. And so it's certainly from the view of sanctions, like supposed to be a pretty big hit, especially over the long term. Also access to goods, export control is another thing that's been broadly discussed, particularly in the high-end technological realm. So Russia relies a decent amount on imports from the Western world for a lot of its high-tech products, which are essential for many of its other industries, like the energy industry, resource extraction in general, computing, whatever it may be. And so there's also export controls going up to try and limit their access to these products. I think, if I recall correctly, the Biden administration said we're essentially cutting off 50% of their supply of high-end technological goods, which once again would presumably be a relatively large hit, especially over the long term to the Russian economy. Those are the two areas that come to mind immediately. They have said that cutting off Russia from the SWIFT global payment system is still on the table. It is still an option. And that would essentially hamper Russia's ability to trade things like oil, its resources on global markets with other countries. There are, however, major downsides to that, which is why we aren't pursuing that first. namely that it would greatly impact our European partners and allies. Same with things that would specifically target Russian energy, right? Because in that case, Europe would be taking almost as big of a hit as Russia would by limiting, cutting off their number one supplier for energy and heat. And so we're trying to be careful, flexible in the sanctions that we apply, the U.S. government being we, and that's that could change though. Like there are other things they've been pretty clear that like they could be even more severe than they already are, and that they're holding back in a sense. And they have said that Americans are going to feel the cost of defending democracy abroad, right? And that's kind of, as a libertarian background, especially, I hate hearing about having to pay a price at home to defend democracy abroad. It sends shivers down my spine. I remember Washington's speech about specifically not going abroad to like slay monsters.
Yeah.
Bears included in monsters, right?
The funny thing, well, I just kind of did like a weird 2-hour live stream earlier where I was just like reading antiwar.com and scrolling through Twitter. And I mentioned this, that Jen Psaki essentially said there's a price to pay when you're fighting for freedom. And it is funny to hear freedom, in their mouths when like everything is happening here with just the past 2 years lockdowns and what they've advocated for when it comes to
that was Trudeau the other day too. Had this whole grandstanding statement about protecting the values and standing up against authoritarianism while at the same time shutting down all the freedom convoys there and the pulling people from their churches and whatnot over the past couple
years.
Use
a progressive term. It's tone deaf on Trudeau's part.
Yeah.
And it's kind of even funnier and stereotypical that the way specifically they believe Americans will be impacted is as at the gas pump. They think gas prices are going to continue to just skyrocket and rise. And so that's where they're also taking efforts, talking to major oil producers and suppliers and distributors, trying to make sure they can, if need be, offset the. They do have to kind of cut Russia off more severely in that realm. But there's also theorizing going on that gas prices are going to be rising regardless, and that this is kind of passing the blame to something, kind of correlation but not causation situation. They're going to pretend that there's causation. I think there's probably a kernel of truth to both. Gas prices have been rising. It's not unexpected. Inflation's hitting hard. All these things could be made worse, of course, by active armed conflict, especially if the U.S. gets pulled in deeper. And I really worry. I kind of joked about this with you, but I am serious. When you see Russian strikes so close to like the Polish border, for example, there in Western Ukraine, it takes one private with access to artillery and who's bad at math to accidentally shell NATO territory, right? Somebody that he doesn't understand the dial right, poorly trained, and all of a sudden, a mortar goes somewhere it's not supposed to. That's always concerning as a NATO ally, because we've also been very, very clear that we will rush to the aid of any NATO ally that gets attacked, and that's where you get the real snowball effect of conflict.
And a lot of people really are. I've heard some people have reached out to me just saying like, well, we should. Just like in the period right before what has recently happened with like the United States, like they're saying that we should defend Ukraine and all of their different prescriptions for how we should handle this. But like the fact that we're even this close is my complaint. Like the fact that we've been applying this much pressure since the 90s, right? Like since we have probably before then, but like since we have been expanding NATO, like mistakes are so possible, especially when you're dealing with soldiers close to borders like this. And like I was reading some Michael Tracy tweets earlier. I think actually it was Kyle Flinsky, and he's like, I don't think people realize just how close we could be pulled into like a real war right now, like boots on the ground. And being that Russia has more nukes than the United States, like the fact that we're even this close is what makes me pissed off. So
yeah, it's definitely it's uncomfortable being on the brink, and I think that's why this issue is getting so much attention. Is because we haven't been in that potential, like close to doomsday scenario in quite some time now. And this is, there's been military action around the world, largely involving the U.S. military, to be fair, but a conflict on the European continent between powers like Russia and Ukraine and NATO That's something that we really haven't seen as possible in some time. And whether that be because of naivety or just put burying heads in the sand, I'm not sure, but it's definitely boiled to the surface.
So so I think my second question I was going to ask earlier, it relates, and it's kind of as to where we're going from here, like geopolitically and individually and such. And so you talked earlier about the conflicting promises. There's the promise to Ukraine that when they disarmed their nuclear arsenal, they are then granted protection, in order to protect themselves, so they don't have that, and as well as the agreements with Russia that I believe it was like past Germany, is that like NATO wasn't going to expand past that.
Just into the post-Soviet spheres.
Okay, yeah. So then we have those conflicting promises, and so the first part of my question is, what form are those in the form of treaties? Are those in the form of just gentlemen's agreements, handshakes, or is it like, do we have actual quote unquote like obligations? Should this action you talked about, if a stray missile goes into Poland, then boom, that triggers a whole bunch of NATO actions and such. Are we, and I don't know how much the U.S. will keep to their word in any scenario, but are there specific obligations either in a certain act or just how it was formulated? Like how would those responses be triggered, and what path might we take?
So I believe it's Article 5. It's an Article 5 commitment, part of NATO membership and commitment, which says an attack on one ally is an attack on all allies, right? So that's really the core principle of the NATO defensive alliance. If anyone's attacked, you're essentially attacking a much, much larger foe than there otherwise would have been as atomized, independent, defending states, right? And as to like where we're going from here and how the agreements work, Finland, for example, borders Russia and is not a member of NATO. Finland has also said it doesn't particularly have like immediate aspirations to join NATO. It's relatively self-sufficient in its defense needs, as I understand it, has one of the larger, better trained defense compared to a lot of other European nations. And so Russia, despite bordering it, and despite Finland also having previously been Russian territory in history, you don't see the same sort of tension as going on here as between Russia and Ukraine. Whereas Ukraine has explicitly expressed much more intent to get under the NATO umbrella and the NATO sphere, especially since they've had more Western-friendly governments in power in Kiev. And so one of the things about NATO is you can't join if you're in an active conflict, right? So in 2014, part of the thinking was perhaps Russia's doing this to keep Ukraine bogged down in even a minor conflict, purely so on paper it's ineligible to join NATO, right? And certainly right now they couldn't join NATO. I mean, why would NATO ally with a country actively under attack? You're just essentially declaring war on whoever is attacking them, then, right? And that's a big, bold decision that NATO wouldn't necessarily want to take. And this might be a good segue into like the world order talks, which are like, where are we going from here? How is the world order going to change? How are things going to be impacted? I do want to almost go the total opposite direction, way back, and why Russia and Ukraine are so closely tied historically. Like why is it that on one side you have Russia essentially saying Ukraine used to be a part of us and still should be in many senses and in many areas part of us, and why Ukraine is so firm about having its own independent, distinct national identity. Because if you just throw into this, especially as a younger person, you weren't even around for the Ukrainian SSR, right? Where you were just the Soviets, not necessarily like a Russian Ukraine, and there wasn't as big of a difference, I think, in the common mind as there has been in the post-Soviet sphere. So Ukraine, I think, in a black humor sense, its name means borderlands, essentially. Ukraine, like a krai is like an area, and u in this case is a prefix essentially denoting like on the edges of, on the periphery of. And so there's conflicts in the borderlands, right? And the reason it's a borderland is because it's right there between Russia proper, Russia really being Eurasian as a country, versus Ukraine is pretty distinctly there on the European continent. It's the bridge there on the Black Sea, which links them to the Western world. Ukraine also then has much more influence from other European powers and cultures, right? So their language is distinct. Ukrainian is its own East Slavic language, as is Belarusian, right? And it has more influence from Polish, from German, from Belarusian. Languages closer to it geographically, cultures that have been in closer contact with the people in that area of what was just broadly the Russian Empire. Now, deep historically, the Rus, the Kievan Rus, were founded in Kiev, as the name would indicate. So the Russian people, the Russian culture at its very birth and genesis was actually founded there on what is now modern-day geographic Ukraine. And so there's historical significance then for the Russian people. Russia, as the seeming successor state to the Rus, would love to symbolically have that location back. Now, Ukraine might point out, what's the first word of Kiev in Rus? It's Kievan, and Kiev is Ukraine, right? And so there are interesting dynamics that are very, very, very old. Ukraine has had several foundings in the past couple centuries as like an independent political entity with various borders. Once again, bits were added onto Ukraine like as a formal entity during the Soviet sphere. Some of the peripheral regions there, like Crimea, was kind of given as a gift of sorts to the Ukrainian people. And so that's where you see where it's kind of messy to have, even nowadays, this political entity, this sovereign state, which has conflict and interaction and engagement with two very different spheres. It is the borderlands. And so it's only kind of correct symbolically that in this great shift, this great recollision between the Atlantic West and kind of the Eurasian East, the fact that it's sparking here in Ukraine in the borderlands, where very fertile land and sea, very fertile land meets the sea there. It's symbolically beautiful and tragic. So I feel it's important to note kind of very quickly that deeper historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, lest people be either under the impression that they are one and the same or entirely distinct, because there is just undoubtedly entangled and meshing between the two culturally, historically.
I'm gonna let the connection, it just lagged for a little bit, but before we get into kind of the world order kind of stuff with the United States being this unipolar power, I think I just want to bring up kind of like Ukraine's response again. I know that they are saying that this implicates all of Europe. This is an attack against all of Europe. So the argument almost seems to be that like, I'm not in NATO, but I implicitly am in NATO. So what do you make of this? And do you expect Western countries other than the United States to respond? Because I think sometimes even libertarians forget like the United States is the only person that can get involved here.
That is true.
The UK might do something. I have no idea. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, this is where it's, I think, important to zoom out just from NATO and how NATO is involved to how this is a larger kind of cultural civilizational clash going on right here. So I'm trying to think of a good way to kind of frame this without kind of getting ahead of the question. But you can see the West outside of NATO, right? You get into these countries, like you talked about Finland, where they're pretty clearly culturally and civilizationally part of this more Western Atlantic sphere, but they're not formally part of NATO, right? Well, they're still condemning the attacks in their government, right? We see countries across South America and Africa, last night the Security Council, were likewise condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. So you see beyond just NATO proper into the larger Western Atlantic sphere is condemning and coming together to take response. So wherever people can, they kind of are. So, the UK and the EU and all these Western countries are doing their own sanctions. It's a coordinated sanctions package, not just by the US, but by the US and all these other countries as well. Japan, even as I recall seeing, launched their own restrictions on Russia, their own sanctions in a sense. So that shows that it goes beyond NATO, and it's really a broader civilizational clash taking place, or broader tensions in the geopolitical world are coming into light and having to be addressed kind of because they're in our faces now, or they could have been addressed. There have been people who have wanted them to be addressed for some time. That's where we look at people like Ron Paul, where he's talked extensively about the potential blowbacks of U.S. global policing, of an expansionist U.S. foreign policy, of a U.S. who believes its duty, its right, and its responsibility to protect democracy around the globe. Right? There have been people who have criticized these ideas, and they face criticism themselves. Ron Paul was told that he sided with terrorists when he just pointed out that part of the hatred in the Middle Eastern world for the U.S. was a result of blowback from our military operations and our diplomatic policies in that region of the world. And I don't think it should be any different now. We can condemn a military operation that results in the death of soldiers and civilians alike, while also recognizing that it's not just out of the blue, that there are legitimate reasons that a conflict has come to light, and we would just look very bad not to take it as a moment of self-reflection on the world stage, right? That's where I said on our last podcast, I don't feel as though we should be beholden to the promises of neoconservatives decades ago. We have a responsibility as younger people to rethink what America may look like as a player on the world stage. The role that alliances like NATO might play, whether we are as a country willing to define ourselves as this protector of global freedom, because that would be a shift from our founding mythos of we are the North American continent, we will remain here in our distinct Western New World sphere of influence and not involve ourselves with the affairs of Europe and the rest of the world. So we would be departing from our founding myth, kind of one of the core principles of our country, and we've been departing from that foreign policy for decades. I don't want to make it sound as though it's like brand new, but it would be a very final, definite moment of, I think, are we going to go and stand up to challenges to the current world order and maintain our unipolar hegemony, the Pax Americana, as long as we can? Do we want a 1,000-year Pax Americana? Or are we willing to give up the seeming benefits and detriments of being the unipolar global superpower, accept that the end of history didn't come, and figure out where we fit in a more multipolar sustainably in the long term by recognizing that maybe the Atlantic enlightened democratic values aren't for everyone. Aristotle had a great point that you don't try and shoehorn people into a politics. You have to make a politics match the people. And culturally, anthropologically, historically, politically, people across the world are different. Not everyone is suited to be in the same place, the same structure, the same system at the same time. It would be a great shame to lose the great diversity on this planet of all sorts and all senses to try and have a homogenized global system.
Yeah, there was this moment that happened right after the withdrawal from Afghanistan where the conservative movement recognized and had to reflect in hindsight, or they reflected on the Ron Paul campaign, and people were finally admitting that he was right. And Ron Paul was trending for like 2 days on Twitter. And obviously it took how long for them to finally, because his first real moment where he was kind of talking about blowback, I believe that was in the 2012 debate. I'm not sure. Someone will probably get mad at me for getting that wrong. But
I'm sure he talked about it on the House floor at some point.
Yeah, but either way, so that happened. It took a long time for that one, the Giuliani moment, when they finally when they were attacking him, and Giuliani said he was crazy, that he had to withdraw his statement, and everyone attacked him as being this crazy guy. And now there are some real threads in the Republican Party right now, represented by like people like Matt Walsh, Candace Owens, are kind of arguing these non-interventionist policies. And Tucker Carlson has 5 million viewers a night. And what's interesting is on this Russia issue, it's very similar in that, like, Ron Paul was getting criticized for making these remarks about these wars that were going on, and America still really cared about and thought that we need to fight. Now you have people like Tulsi Gabbard last night saying that that we shouldn't have backed NATO expansion, and instantly within like an hour there were like 80,000 people tweeting about her being a Russian or a traitor and a Russian asset. I was accused by some people I thought I was pretty friendly with on Facebook, and they blocked me. They said that I worked for Russia, the Russian government, which is, it's just crazy to see that propaganda start to infect and kind of like possess family members and friends. And I mean, we saw it with COVID, but I do think that like things are going to be different, and for the next, like, who knows how long, people really are going to change tone towards Russia. I went out, or the student group that I run went out on campus, and they were asking students what they thought about going to war with Russia. Most of them were opposed to it, but I don't know if that would be the case anymore. If we went out today, I think the tone would change. Maybe people would be a little less likely to comment. They might walk by because they don't want to like stand out or something like that, give their opinion. So it is kind of weird times, and I don't really know what to make of it right now, and what's going to happen. Do you see it falling into something? Do you see it becoming something greater, or do you think that really there will be like a compromise here, or something like that?
Something greater. I mean, I would say there are a plethora of potential consequences that are significant that could come out of this. Some which I would say would be remarkable progress for the better. Some which I would say would be obviously greatly detrimental to all of humankind. To go from best case to worst case. In the very best case scenario, we take this moment of self-reflection. We make a sincere effort, and hopefully Russia would as well make a sincere effort to sit down at the table and throw away all of the last several decades, the last century of respective foreign policies and geopolitical structures and defense pacts and alliances, and really sit down and say, if we restarted this whole thing, if we got to start and rebuild our respective structures and our relationship from scratch, what would that look like? And I think, of course, there'd be opposing visions, but I think we'd find one. But I think it would take, on our part, a great humility to step down from that position as the leading global superpower, one of one on the world stage, the one and only USA, great protector of freedom and democracy across the globe. And on the Russian side as well, they would have to also humble themselves and recognize that they are now working in a globally communicative society for which their consequences have a great rippling impact, regardless of whether or not they would like it to be that way, regardless of whether or not they intend for it to be that way. And so if both nations, if both peoples, governments could really sit down and reflect with humility on how they can restructure relationships in the system, that would be absolute best case. Now that's incredibly optimistic and wishful thinking as well, because people are set in their ways, especially because Russia and the U.S. are both somewhat gerontocracies. They're run by older people who were brought up in the Cold War bipolar world mindset, where they have an agenda, they have a block, and they have to not only maintain but expand that power. And the transition to a multipolar world order, to use this buzzword again, would just require great humility on behalf of governments and people, and that's a lot to ask for as well. Worst case scenario, things escalate. Once again, we could see an invasion of a NATO country or accidental hitting of a NATO country. We could see Biden or the West go back on their words about not engaging in the Ukraine, and we could see this escalate into full-blown nuclear war. Once again, I, as wishful and optimistic as the first path was, that's also incredibly doomsday pessimistic. Nuclear war is largely fake and gay, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But I understand the looming threat that people feel seeing pictures of mushroom clouds and the like.
Right. Well, I heard that last night there were, again, it was kind of like in this moment where no one knew what was happening, but there were reports that there were strikes in Moldova, and I was like, oh no. Because at that point I'm like, what are they doing? Are they pushing up against NATO? Like,
Did you have
Yeah.
chime in there?
Yeah, because I mean, the goal of all of this is to get to that perfect solution that you're talking about. That involves, the U.S. humility. It involves in a degree of like the Russian government's humility and like being able to like put aside the fact that they feel they've been wronged by this, and that. And so what I'm really curious about is, and I'm presuming that you have more experience with like the Russian people and the Russian culture and this and that. So in the U.S., there's very much and I'm speaking very generally, but very much a birthright mentality of, the number one superpower. That's not just a government thing that boils down all the way to, being a kid. And, I grew up in a military family. And so you very much, the pride of saluting to the flag and, standing for colors and taps and stuff when it's played on military bases. And, the idea that like, almost the duty that you were talking about to be the world's police and to be the shining city on a hill, but not only the shining city on the hill, the shining city on the hill that goes and build shining cities on every other hill across the whole world. And to provide an example of all that in the different cultures, and kind of there's a weird idea of like blending multiculturalism as well as integration by spreading our values, integrating our values into other people's cultures as opposed to like having them do that. But that's I feel like the mainstream, and you could call it moderate centrist citizens of the U.S. are very tied into that in the government. It's almost like a direct pipeline between, heartland America, patriotism, almost a blind patriotism and like government action, like support. Everybody's got to support our troops, like everybody supports troops. That it's not nowadays. There's been a less of that anti-American, anti like Vietnam War sentiment that you had kind of in the mid 20th century, and it's very much into like a support our troops. And if you don't support this war, like you're a traitor. And that's just a mainstream view. So I'm very curious. If you have any insight into how the Russian citizens themselves view their government, and if they have that same kind of, because I feel like there's the Russian government, and if you listen to what Putin explicitly said, I mean, you can't really, like you said, speculate too much on what it hit, but if you take his words at face value, like they feel like they've been stilted and wronged through various levels by the Western world. Do the Russian people share the same kind of sentiment on the whole?
It really varies. Once again, as much as the American people differ and diverge from the American government, so too do the Russian people very often differ from their government and agree with it as well. It's broad sectors of society are very anti-Kremlin. We have seen since the military operations in Ukraine relatively large-scale protests in major Russian cities against Putin and against the military operations there. Those are largely young people who are in like the educated, like the intelligentsia class. They've gone to university. They're more familiar with the Western world. And once again, it's in bigger cities that also have that more cosmopolitan influence: St. Petersburg, Moscow. And Russian police have been, in certain cases, cracking down on those protests.
There's been about 2,000
lots of arrests so far. And so that goes to show that they are relatively large-scale protests as well. And certainly not the first of their kind. Russians fairly frequently go out in mass protests and get mass arrested as well, fairly frequently. That being said, there is obviously a fair amount of support for Putin. He has a strong and relatively stable base. And we did a deeper dive on the last podcast, but if you can understand how awful and unstable and uncertain the 1990s were for Russians, and the seeming stability and reigning into control and relative prosperity of what Putin has at times brought to the Russian people, you can understand where the sympathy and support for him comes among Russians. It really is in contrast to what was before Putin, the chaos of the Yeltsin years and the 1990s oligarch and gang ran Russia. So once again, just like there are Americans here who are very vehemently pro-war and those who are very vehemently anti-war, there's also the same case in Russia. One interesting thing to note, though, on the U.S. relationship in terms of our people more than our governments is, I think, something even other scholars on this really overlook is the remarkable similarities between the Russian and the American story real and the Russian and American people, right? So we are broadly multicultural empires, right? So Russia spans from one ocean to the other ocean, right? From Atlantic to Pacific in a very similar way to us. They moved from one side to the other in a series of great explorations by notable Russian explorers into the wilderness, their versions of Lewis and Clark. They interacted with indigenous people, if I'm not totally out of date anthropologically, the Native Americans of North America are very, very genetically closely related to the native peoples outside area of the eastern part of Russia. And so they also have, their tribal cultures, their tribal identities, which are kept and maintained there in semi-autonomous regions throughout Siberia and some of their northern provinces. So we're coast to coast, multi-ethnic empires that kind of expanded from one side to the other and integrated a wide variety of cultures as well. In the Soviet era, they had integration of the Baltic cultures, those other, Belarusian, Ukrainian culture. Central Asia continues to this day to leak in prominently into modern Russia. Lots of workers, people are immigrating from former Soviet Central Asian states like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan to Russia proper for work. So you see where, like us, they're also somewhat of a melting pot. Even though it might not seem like it on the surface, they are a remarkably diverse country. Now they're also a federation like us. They're organized in a very similar way where they have regional level and local level governments which report to a higher level federal government with much broader authorities and oversight. Their constitution is partly modeled after ours. It's much, much, much longer and more complicated and more convoluted than ours. It really gives an appreciation for the American Constitution. And this will get us back to kind of the civilizational world stage talk. People very firmly lump America in with the sea power sphere, the Atlantic sphere. And sea power sphere is very much associated with things like trade, commerce, Enlightenment values, things that were kind of born out of, British, Dutch, American Enlightenment and industrial age culture from modernity as we know it in the West. And then land power cultures are more focused on the honors, virtues, often more militant and warlike, a greater emphasis on, what we might call like social conservative traditional values. And so the U.S. has traditionally been placed more in the sea power Atlantic sphere, and that's where we ended up now alongside our Western European allies. But I think what we've shown, especially through American expansion as well, is we have a strong heartland culture as well. I think we're not explicitly a sea culture, and I think one thing that shows that is that the American coasts are very, very different from the American interior, right? Politically, culturally, and I think it's reflected in the values of those people as well. I am only speculating here, but I guess if you polled people on the coasts versus Middle America on whether they support going and engaging militarily in Ukraine, I would reckon that people on the coast would be not far more, but statistically more in favor of intervention than those in the heartland. And that has not always been the case, right? Because the American military is a volunteer military. The Russian military is largely conscripts, right? Young men, if you don't go to college or you don't have a medical exemption, you have to serve your mandatory military service duty, and then you go on reserve. So as a result, Russia, similarly now in this situation, they've banned military-aged men from leaving the country. They're organizing their own kind of emergency conscription defense programs going on. But the U.S. being volunteer military has to have the public support behind a war cause in order to have an effective military. You cannot wage effective war without immense costs and hurdles to get over if the soldiers aren't behind the cause, right? And with a lot of what we know about the demographics and military population's leanings politically, especially along the young infantry combat males, their support for the Biden administration in general and their support for this war, I think would be it's low and it'd be a hurdle to get over for the U.S. military for sure. Especially with morale problems already relatively low with the vaccine mandates and the like. I would be hesitant to think our military is at its full 100% readiness might And that is concerning should things escalate to full-blown conflict.
So going back to the people though of these countries, I think there's a very interesting phenomenon. This is probably for both of you to answer. Today, I think probably marked a very interesting event in history, and not for the actions, but of the ability for people to interact with those on the other side. Today, I interacted on Twitter in the span of 15 minutes with individuals from the U.S., individuals in the U.S. military, individuals in the Ukraine military, citizens of Ukraine, citizens of Russia, all of that, like the public forums that exist because of social media and just widespread internet connection, worldwide, or at least more worldwide than it has been in the past 20 years. I think that's a very, very interesting thing, and I don't know, and I don't really know how that might change public perception, because there's kind of like on a small scale, or not a small scale, on a large scale, but of a small degree, a homogenization of the world and the values and like those differences you talked about, the difference of cultures and this and that. Now the fact that I'm on Twitter sharing memes with people living in St. Petersburg, like that changes a lot. And our values may still have their differences, and our cultural practices may have their differences, but the very fact that during the Cold War, the likelihood that any American individual would have any contact with any Russian individual was minuscule low. So much so that if you were even suspected of having contact, you were court-martialed, or you were brought in for interrogation, or this like that much so. And then now I've spoken with the quote-unquote enemy throughout the whole day today, and I think that's just a very interesting phenomenon to kind of think on.
Yeah, I was having this exact conversation with some people earlier about how interesting this hyper online engagement with war is, right? Because we've had, once again, military conflicts in the 21st century where people can live stream things, post to Twitter, post to TikTok, whatever. But I mean, right now it's at an unprecedented level. It's only gone up since the last major conflict. And so to have this level of seeming engagement 24/7 at our fingertips with a war on the other side of the world is something I don't think human individuals necessarily built for. I'm not sure psychologically, sociologically, we're prepared and evolved to be caring that much about conflicts so remote and abstract to us in a concrete sense, that I do think that's part of why this is like kind of such a weird engagement, public forum discussion. And also going back to humility, informational humility right now is so much more important than ever before, because even though we can see missile strikes and artillery barrages and troops marching down streets and tanks rolling around in fields, and believe like we're right there in the war front, we know really nothing about those videos. I mean, verifying the authenticity of so much of it is beyond what the average person is willing to do for every single video that they look at, right? And
I mean, the video games, right? Like
we literally people sharing videos of ARMA, like military simulation video games. And granted, I see why you could be fooled if you weren't actively looking out for it. But that's where really, in a sense, and this is painful to say as someone who likes to stay as engaged and accurate as possible, if you're not feeling the shaking of the ground from that rocket strike, you don't know jack shit about what just happened. If you didn't see, the Russian flag on the side of the jet that launched a rocket into a building, like with your own two eyes, like in the era of video manipulation, especially in the era where people are recycling old videos on social media or just straight up video editing them,
That's our World War II reenactment videos.
Yeah,
being posted today and purported to be, on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, and it takes not only humility to recognize when you want to do that, saying, I'm sorry, I shared some wrong videos. These were misattributed, mislabeled. But at the same time, you also have to almost take preventative, not just reactive measures, and be humble in every single piece of information that you come across, right? As much as the West loves to talk about, everything that you see out there that's not us is Russian propaganda, right? But like inversely, granted that's true to a certain extent, but they're engaged in the same exact media games. The BBC versus RT putting out stories, they're very, very, very similar entities at the end of the day, but with two different foundational meta-narratives at the core, two worldviews, informing them differently in how they're presenting and dealing and processing with the information that they're giving in, right? So I would implore everyone out there, even with this podcast, and I'm not saying fact check every single thing, but particularly with photos and videos of war in the region, just realize that you are not as connected as you think, right? We have a certain arrogance of the informational age, and we need humility more than anything in such a hyper-connected, virtual, digitized world.
Someone's asking some epistemology questions right now.
I like it. Getting deep.
Even if you feel it, if you feel the ground shaking, do you know? Can you know?
And once again, this is all, you can trust your senses above all else, and you can't even trust your senses, right? And really, I know that you're kind of half joking there with that question, but that is really getting at the crux of the issue here, which is you have to be willing to be skeptical of most things, despite feeling so empowered and special by having unprecedented informational access through the internet and through social media.
Yeah, it's funny to kind of take a different angle from what you kind of noted right there, is the way that the Ukrainian Twitter account responded to everything last night, like posting memes. Like I think that demonstrates exactly what you're talking about. Like humans are not built for this. Like
it's so weird. We don't know what we're doing. We're stumbling and finding our way through these.
Yeah, like it really does feel like a simulation or something, or like we're literally just apes trying to figure out what we're doing right now. It's really that level. But before we continue, and if you have any more questions, I kind of wanted to go through some of the comments because we got quite a bit.
We have a chat to answer.
We do. Can kind of be a little break. So someone was asking, was Biden threatening to launch a cyber attack?
Good question. So part of what is believed to be the standard Russian military operations playbook involves a wide range of cyber operations and attacks against whatever the enemy would be. So in this case, I don't think they formally attributed to the Russians, but it is largely suspected that recent disruptions of Ukrainian government websites, for example, are due to Russian activity. It would be in line with what U.S. and other intelligence expects from a Russian military operation. And the Biden administration has made clear through several spokespeople that if the U.S. critical infrastructure, U.S. businesses, U.S. government is targeted by Russian cyber attacks, that the U.S. will take appropriate retaliatory measures. Now, they have been very opaque about what that means, whether that means we're going to nuke you because you cyber attack us, or whether we're going to try and cyber attack you back. And that's where this is a relatively unexplored area of engagement between the U.S. and a near peer competitor, where we clearly could out cyber the Taliban. It's much harder to out cyber the Russians. So I don't know the specifics because I haven't shared them, but the Biden administration has threatened to retaliate to any potential cyber attack. I wouldn't put it past them to just do it outright, preemptively. But if we take them at their word, it would only be retaliatory.
Someone else saying Putin and Xi are being tricked into providing their own regional security as it should be. Same person said Ukraine was only a regional distinction, not a country.
And that's what I was getting at. In the Soviet era, it was a part of the Ukrainian SSR. It was a part of the Russian Empire. And so it's been known as its own region and area, right? It's the borderlands region, Ukraine, but it's still relatively distinct. It's like there's a reason we're able to point to a Ukraine, even if there's disagreements about exactly where those borders are and exactly what it means. Like there is something there historically and culturally that's not Russia as we.
All right, and this guy's also asking, wasn't Kiev the crown jewel of Catherine the Great's empire?
So the kind of seat of power of Russia has changed several times over history. So you have the Kievan Rus, as I talked about at the beginning.
About how far back?
That's like 988, I want to say, is when Vladimir the Great Christianized and baptized the Russian people and kind of symbolically started the Rus as the empire we know now. And there was Slavic pre-Rus pagans and everything. There region. And we can get into the Varangians, which were like Vikings, which came and took governance over those Slavic people in those areas. But to get to the chase, it moves from the Kievan Rus. You had Novgorod was very prominent for some time. That's another older Russian city. Eventually, things kind of settle around Moscow, largely during the Mongol-Tatar yoke, which is like that kind of Mongol-influenced Golden Horde era of Russian history, where kind of these regional warlord feudal lords were vassals of it was a complicated mess, but eventually then you get the Russian Empire proper, and under Peter the Great, they construct St. Petersburg using Swedish slave labor from the Northern War there. So yeah, St. Petersburg's like built on a swamp. It's an Enlightenment city, so it's like on a grid fitted to the not particularly hospitable landscape right there on the Baltic. And so that became the capital for some time. And then under the Soviet era, it moved back to Moscow, and they renamed St. Petersburg to Leningrad. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, the seat of power remained there in Moscow at the Kremlin. So we say the Kremlin, right? And I just want to get this out there. There are multiple Kremlins. Kremlin just means fortress, essentially. And so many cities in Russia and Eastern Europe have, Kremlins, but like the Kremlin is the one in Moscow. I just wanted to make that distinction for those who might come across a Kremlin in another city and be confused.
So now this guy's getting to the serious questions, Ethan. He's wondering if gingers have souls.
It's been hotly debated, as this issue. I would say yes. In fact, I would say if anything have more of a soul. It's hard to comprehend. But spirit bears, if you didn't know, like those like spirit bears, they're not albino. They actually just have the same red hair gene as causes red hairs in humans. You can have your coat that you don't have Neanderthal genetics, because that's a thing that I think people theorize, that red hair is linked to having Neanderthal genetics. And if you're just like salty that you don't have it, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you. But
the other thing is, what is this guy talking about? Russia only started existing in my mind when Putin put bounties on Americans' heads in Syria, which is that's hilarious, right? Like, and I think I thought it was Afghanistan, not Syria, but I mean, they don't talk about Syria as much. That narrative has not been talked about really at all, because it was disproven that Russia was putting bounties on Americans' heads in Afghanistan.
Well, and Russia has their own, right, the Soviet Union rather, has their own extensive history with Afghanistan. As I'm sure many people watching know, they were not the first, but in recent times there in the 20th century, launched their own invasion of Afghanistan. Weren't particularly successful due to Western-backed Mujahideen fighters. Thanks, Osama. And a lot of great Soviet culture came out of that. You have like Kino, which is a great Russian band, and they were kind of writing themes that emerged from that Soviet-Afghan war. Lots of great movies, like what is it, like Cargo 200 is a good movie, and that's like it's linked to Afghan Soviet war themes. Anyway, just to note that the Russians, Soviets, have their own history in Afghanistan, and Russia, as the Russian Federation, post-Soviet, has had relatively extensive involvement in the Middle East as well. They've, of course, backed the Assad regime. They're certainly closer to Iran than the US and the West is. They tend to not always by default take a opposite stance to whatever the US is, because we share allies. We're both relatively firm allies with Israel, if I'm not mistaken. Russian behind English and Hebrew is like the most common language in Israel. It might even be higher, I could be wrong about that, but Russian is there's a very prominent Russian diaspora community in Israel. That's largely because there's lots of Eastern European, Soviet, Russian Empire Jews from the Pale of Settlement. That's something related to Catherine the Great, now modern day Belarus, Ukraine, as a place in the Russian Empire to settle the vast majority of the Jewish population. They had the largest Jewish population in the world prior to certain events, and then a lot moved both during the Soviet days and since to Israel. So we share that ally. But We also find ourselves clashing with Russia in Africa now, just as China, through their Belt and Road Initiative, has tried to get their foot in the door in Africa and South America. Russia hasn't seemed as focused as China, but they certainly continue to try and exert influence where they can. With Venezuela, they tend to back Venezuela, especially when it's spatting with the U.S. As I mentioned, Iran and Syria. Recently, they've kind of gotten into it with France over sending like Russian forces into Mali in Africa, which is traditionally like French forces are responsible for security operations and counterterrorism there. So Russia certainly does have several areas where it does challenge U.S. Western hegemony outside of the Eurasian continent, but I wouldn't say it's particularly prominent. And on the Russian-China thing, quickly, people who may be under the misconception that they're strong allies, they're definitely allies of convenience when it comes to countering the West and establishing themselves further as regional and global powers. But there's many areas of tension between Russia and China as well. Chinese are increasingly settling parts of Eastern Russia, which of course Russia doesn't necessarily like. China has Arctic ambitions, which Russia doesn't necessarily like, because they'd like to kind of be the sole benefactor of Arctic expansion and development and trade routes and the like, resource extraction. China wants to continue advancing its sphere of influence there in Central Asia, and that's historically in recent times, Russian sphere of influence. And so there are definitely tensions in the dragon bear relationship, as they call it. So even though China, for example, at the Security Council is not so quick to condemn Russia and is much more sympathetic or at least neutral on this whole Ukraine situation, don't be fooled into thinking that they're steadfast allies. They're as much allies as Stalin and Hitler were prior to Barbarossa.
Yeah, and on the point about Afghanistan, again, it's like our funding of the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union. And I believe, and you might know a lot more about this than I do, that there's some connection with the Mujahideen, at least in Russia's eyes, as it pertains to the Chechnyan terrorists that Putin, or at least like the Russian culture was kind of reacting to. Do you know anything about that?
Well, generally, this may not exactly answer your question, but Russia has a interesting relationship with the Islamic faith. Compared to, I think, pretty much every other European country, it has a significant Muslim minority population. I think it's like 20% of Russians at this point, and that's largely because of Central Asians of Muslim faith who immigrate to Russia, and those in the Caucasus as well. The Caucasus being there, for those who may not know, between like Russia and Turkey, kind of where the south of Russia merges into the Middle East. And there's lots of ethnic groups there who adopted the Muslim faith. And so there are lots of mosques, especially in the Russian cities where these people are moving to. And Putin has largely embraced, the Muslim faith, whether that be because of population demographic reasons or otherwise. But like you said, there is an interesting relationship with Chechnya in particular, given the wars that Russia has had with Chechnya over both very, very confirmed and alleged acts of terrorism, the Beslan school massacre, Moscow theater incident, apartment bombings in Moscow. And so there has been some animosity between Chechnyans who viewed themselves as pretty much unrightfully colonized by Russia, as though they should have gotten independence after the fall of the Soviet Union as well. But Chechnyans are distinct in that way. Grozny is a relatively big city. It was the site of extensive shelling and military operations there during the Chechen wars, when Russia was engaging in military operations there. And so many of the vets, kind of like we have our vets of like the early 2000s and stuff there from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, lots of like the seasoned Russian soldiers in their military have action in Chechnya, primarily because that Afghanistan, if they were 20 in the 1980s, that puts them well into their 50s, 60s, whatever. They're at the elder age of the working force, and so those who would be engaged in combat operations presumably are likely more experienced if they are from operations in places like Chechnya.
So some of the other comments, someone just said warm water ports and Orthodox Christianity.
Both great topics. There's so many like sub points to touch on. It's hard to get them all.
Yeah. Diversity is our albatross. Yes, I saw a funny tweet last night. It was like breaking. Putin has yet to decide whether or not racism was involved, or climate change is responsible for something. Yeah, I butchered it, but I covered it in my live stream earlier. Just a joke about like how Biden is going to declare war on Putin for climate change and racism and all this stuff. Said, no good reason not to monetize your streams. I just sent you a couple bucks. I don't think you can until you have 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. I could be wrong about that. And then he said, but no gingers. I don't know what's up with this guy and gingers.
That's fine. I think I lost most of my freckles. So you can call me a redhead, but a ginger. Man, I got like dirty blonde hair. I got a red beard. I got black body hair I could show you. So I'm the rainbow of human biodiversity.
I think he was in the comments last time too. And he said, 2014, we legalized propaganda from our own government. This is why Harambe died. And then the Constitution was fully written and tyrannical before they were forced to add the first and second ... 10th Amendment. Then Monkey Prank said, even if you feel it, can you know? We already got to that one. And then he said, the humility seems to usher in over skepticism to the point where it can almost be paralyzing. To truly know something is left to systems of logic and math where the axioms are determined.
Yeah, and I understand. And that's actually a very, very good point, to not get paralyzed being overly skeptical of information. Like, we have to try and ground ourselves in some reality, right? Like, a human being would go crazy if we truly were so hyper skeptical that we couldn't make a single solid claim about the world, right? That's you can kind of see where that line of philosophical reasoning comes from and where we go there. But the point that I was really making is, I will acknowledge you don't want to get to the point where you just disregard everything as disinformation or, unclear. But just to, especially on things that really deeply impact you or you think would inform your opinion, to just realize that just because you have access to information, unprecedented access, doesn't necessarily mean that that information is good, that it's properly presented, that you have the context, that someone's not actively trying to dupe you. Because people aren't, myself included, as smart as we necessarily like to think. People who truly are engaged in these noospherical informational ops, I like to call it the public relations informational complex, the PRIC. When the PRIC is at work, they know what they're doing. They're skilled in the manipulation of the noosphere and human cognition and consciousness. And when you plug yourself into the internet, hyper-connected noosphere of the 21st century, you click the terms and services, and that's that you're going to be manipulable, and it's your responsibility, not anyone else's, to try and sort it all out. And if you don't try, you're going to be duped. If you try way too much, you're going to be paralyzed, and that's arguably dangerous as well.
This gets into what we were talking about in the last podcast, just towards the end, about like the inauthentic way that a lot of these narratives come about, and how last night with Tulsi Gabbard and Trader being trending, it was just like, where is this coming from? Like it just felt so manufactured. Like it felt like there was some manipulation, because there's no way that this all of a sudden just climbs to the charts of this algorithm. It just didn't make any sense. Just this inauthentic fabrication of narratives. It's easy for people to get possessed and caught up in that, especially if you aren't aware that it's happening.
Yeah, definitely just be careful of the ideas and information that you're playing with, because even if you do disregard it, there are lingering subconscious impressions to consider as well. Once again, I don't mean to sound so dismissive of social media and proper media in general in these times. I do just think, particularly with all of this war footage going around and all the to just realize that maybe you're not meant or equipped to know as much as you think you may be, given the amenity and luxury of the internet and this access to what's going on thousands and thousands of miles away.
So another comment is also consider the fact that Ukraine had a voluntary separation during the dissolution of the USSR. They took a legitimate pathway to have sovereignty.
Yeah, and so I definitely brought that up in the history, that at the moment which the USSR dissolved, which wasn't a singular moment, it was a series of these republics breaking away to form sovereign political bodies of their own, and Ukraine was included there. Where it got sticky was some of the guarantees and some of the assumptions that were seemingly agreed upon and now are conflicting between the two parties. Namely, like Ukraine has brought up now, like the West promised them a certain level of protection in exchange for giving up their status as a nuclear power. And now that they're seeing the consequences of that, we either have to kind of back up our promise or say that was empty, say that that wasn't ever a promise. That's all that I'm saying. I'm certainly not a person to disregard the existence of Ukraine, to say that Ukraine was never its own political entity, because very clearly it has been and is right now. The thing that I think a lot of people are getting thrown into this for the first time, they leave with false impressions because they're only given the last couple of days, last couple of months worth of news on the U.S.-Russia relationship, on the Ukraine-Russia history, and it's like this is an issue with immense complexity and immense historical context that matters in understanding where we are now, where we could go, how we got here, right? And so I hate credentials, which I don't want to say like people need to not engage on issues which they're not experts in. Like I love when people engage in anything, and as someone who has dedicated years to this topic, I love talking about it with people. But once again, you have to enter conversations. Like when I enter conversations on pretty much any specific area of the world geopolitically, like I have a foundational knowledge base, but I'm far from an expert, and I'd be looking like a fool. I'd be unwise and doing myself a disservice by going in there pretending as though I have a full picture. I recognize where I have a surface level understanding, and it seems like lots of people, common commentators, people in the media, politicians, believe they have a much deeper understanding than they really do. And my understanding alone, I'm not a Russian, I'm not a Ukrainian, I'm someone who it's kind of a funny story how I got here. It's in hindsight, I'm just realizing it circles back. In 2014, at my high school here in Montana, we had an exchange student from Eastern Ukraine from an area that's now in Luhansk. It's like dead between where Luhansk and Donetsk is. And it was 2014 when they were an exchange student. So all of the things that went down in Eastern Ukraine and Crimea happened while they were at my high school as an exchange student. They were Russian speaking as well. And eventually, they move back and they leave that state in Eastern Ukraine. They move to Russia proper, where it's safer, where they have more opportunities. And that my interaction with them is part of the reason why when I chose a language at UM, I chose Russian and eventually made it into my major and made it kind of a specialty area for me alongside my political science degree. And now here we are, and I'm reporting after all these years again on the situation between Russia and Ukraine. And so it has rippling consequences that, there's going to be a generation of people, undergraduates in their freshman year right now, who are about to pick up Russian studies programs and are about to enter in specifically because of this conflict, because it brought attention to something that's clearly unresolved. And if we take it properly, it will probably take years and decades to work out on the international stage, to reform the narrative and the structures of the international order. That's not an easy task. It's not a quick task, but it's a task that I think is going to be launched and accelerated by current events.
Yeah, I mean, last night when I was talking to you about this, you volunteered to work and report on everything that was going on last night, and things kind of, I was reading some tweets that were kind of making light of the situation and making fun of some things, and you kind of put it in a perspective for me that, like, yeah, we can laugh about it, but with your connections to this, I think it's almost like, and this kind of gets into the conversation of what we've talked about in the past about objectivity news. You being so close to this, knowing knowing people in Ukraine, or your friend was from Ukraine. I mean, how have you felt through all of this? Because like last night, you're like, I mean, like there are people I know that are there, and you work with people who are there. So
Yeah,
how are you feeling? Just to make this more personal.
Yeah, I mean, so last night, I think that I made some like meme posts or images, but the only serious text post, when I sat there for a while, I'm like, I gotta say something, right? That's a bad urge to have in the social media age, to feel as though you're compelled to say something.
Mm-hmm.
But as, once again, someone who has dedicated years and years of their life to this specific area, whose profession is right here, I almost felt as though I'm doing myself a disservice by not trying to engage. But all I could really think of to say was, I would favor peace and love, and I really I'm conflicted in many senses. I'm just as confused as anyone about where things are and where things could go. I really try and remain an optimist and hopeful about the situation, because I really do think there is so much potential in a relationship between the US and other global powers. I really do think there's immense benefit for humanity to be found in a multipolar world. People may say I'm like overly sympathetic to the Russian view. I'm not thinking of Ukraine enough, and I feel for people on both sides of the conflict a lot, because I mean every death in war is an unnecessary death, right? Regardless of who's firing it, who started it, what, it really doesn't matter once people are dying, soldiers and civilians alike. I know people, I was worried about one of my buddies who, I know he recently got out of like the Russian military for his, conscripted service, just a couple months ago. And I didn't know if they were recalling recently released forces, as is sometimes common in major military operations, especially because I knew he was there in the western parts of Russia. And so, like anyone there, especially people who are literally on the ground in Ukraine and Russia, right? The harshness of war is undeniable, and I don't know exact casualty totals. Once again, it's very unclear trying to get pictures nowadays, but there's undoubtedly had to have been some level of casualty, purposeful or incidental, and I don't like it. I don't like war. I don't like that we've gotten to this point. I don't like that Russia launched its military operation. I don't like that we put them in a situation where I see the Russian perspective. That's where I might come across as overly sympathetic, because I think if there's one thing that, studying and getting a Russian degree and going there and learning from the people and their culture and immersing yourself in the language, is to try and put yourselves in their shoes, so that when something like this happens and Americans in the West are baffled at how Russia can have to do something like this, that someone who is on both sides of the fence can effectively communicate where both sides stand, how we've gotten here, what the positions are. There's a really great famous Russian saying from a poem. It's umom Россию не понять, which is essentially that you cannot understand Russia by means of the mind, right? And kind of my closing quote for the Russian department program was, they say, говорят, что умом Россию не понять. They say that you can't understand Russia with the mind. Но я скажу, что языком я могу. But I say that through language we can. And so I really believe that, having spent time speaking with people in their native tongue, having spent time reading the literature, listening to the music, you get, in a deeper sense than just politics, a perspective, a piece of the Russian soul, the Ruskaya dusha that they so often talk about, in a kind of an ironic sense sometimes, but a sincere one as well. It's hard not to integrate a piece of yourself when you spend so much time. And it's hard not to gain sympathy for Ukraine as well. I mean, studying Russia, in many senses, you have to study Ukraine. Ukraine has been so integral to Russia. Russia has been integral to Ukraine. They're brother nations at the very least. So, yeah, it's kind of long-winded, but I don't like anything about it. I only try and stay optimistic and hope we can make the most out of it. Because if people are going to die, if conflict was unavoidable, if we are in a moment where we've been forced, whether we like it or not, into self-reflection, It would just be a shame if we let that all go to waste. And it's just another conflict that changes nothing about the international tensions that sparked this whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you have any more questions or any comments. And we have been going for an hour and 39 minutes, but I could keep going. Do you have any more stuff?
Not particularly. I think the biggest key, as Ethan was talking about, is that measure of humility and understanding that, in all likelihood we don't understand and we won't understand. And, at least those of us who at the time, the energy you haven't spent the years like put into to determine that. And so, there's no need for the hot takes. There's no need for the rushes to judgment, the rushes to call for, war. And Dave Smith had that tweet today where it's like, someone asked him where the line was for him, from a libertarian to like be called to war or called for war. And he said something along the lines of, I'm probably butchering the quote, but I won't ever call for a war that I'm not willing to fight and die in myself. And I think that's the line. And I think the American perspective, I think it's almost been polluted by the social media that we have. 30 years ago, and not to say that there's a better or worse sides to it, but 30 years ago, these kinds of we think we have more information than we actually do, and that leads us to think that we're more justified in the positions that we have, and therefore more justified in calling for more extremes than we probably should. And I think a measure of restraint and humility is important in terms of what we call or advocate for or believe. But I think there's also, both in a measure of personal responsibility as well as social responsibility to call out those same actions in those, who purport to lead us, in our elected leaders and, those in positions of authority, because they, for better or worse, are the ones that are going to decide the fate of what happens here. And if we allow them to get caught up in the same mistakes that we could get caught up in, and in that lack of real information and, get kind of an American exceptionalism or, a Russian, they're wronged by the Western world and they're owed, blood money for this or whatever. Like, you need to, I guess, I don't really know what I'm trying to say, but like rein them in as well. Like, they should not be overreacting the same way that you shouldn't either. And so, there's a sense of patriotism and, in some ways a blind patriotism that invades, almost the nooks and crannies of government. So, it's the fallback of the U.S. government. The default is, a blind patriotism. And I think kind of, cleaning out those nooks and crannies and realizing, the faults in our own mistakes that have been made in the past, and, in order to avoid making mistakes in the future, because at the end of the day, like, the costs are, it's not the costs of, the elites who are trying to instigate this war. Like, those who are paying the price and those who are dying are, those citizens and those members of, who live in those borderlands. Whose families have felt these conflicts for many years. It's not Vladimir Putin, it's not Joe Biden, it's not any of these people who are feeling the effects of it. They're just pulling the strings, and it's, causing deaths on the ground. It's causing people to fear for their lives of their friends. It's ruining livelihoods. Sanctions are going to destroy economies and destroy livelihoods and, disrupt not just the order of, the geopolitical landscape, but the order of people's lives. And all of that, so you speak very precisely and avoid the hot takes on a situation that I think is beyond the majority of our comprehension, as well as hold those with the power and potentially the information to enact change, hold them responsible, and don't let them make the same mistakes that the people who held their positions 30 years ago also made.
For sure. And shortly on that, like, about the information and distrust from our own side as well, like I said, props to the US intel community for getting this dub, but it's a rare dub, right? That they get an assessment right. And they've been saying candidly that Russia was preparing for an invasion, could launch it any day, and that frankly is what happened. They did launch a military operation pretty much at a moment's notice when they wanted to. But they have to really ask themselves, why is it, they were so frustrated on why there was so much skepticism about their reports, why people wouldn't believe their intelligence assessments. And it's like, you really have no clue why people wouldn't trust your intelligence assessments. Like your batting average isn't exactly for intelligence communities. And so it was a boy who cried wolf situation in many sense. And I hope that once again, in all these moments of self-reflection that can occur, the intelligence community takes that moment of all people, if they could, to self-reflect and realize, like, why doesn't the American public trust us? Why do we have to fight tooth and nail to get them to believe something that we have intelligence about?
Yeah.
It should be an obvious answer, but I guess it's not so obvious to the people on the inside, or at least they are maybe in denial.
And how that's intrinsically tied with like the corporate press and like CNN and why they can't fathom why the American people don't trust them. Like Brian Stelter's rant. I don't know if you guys saw it, but he was
Joe Rogan. He's like, why does everybody trust Joe Rogan, not me? Like,
I think the word he said was real newsrooms. That's the part that I think was terrible, because it's like he's making like an actual like categorical difference between him and what Joe Rogan does, and they're both media. They're both trying to get information out, and I mean, they've got how many things wrong over the last decade, right? And it's someone said we envision. It's the same guy, Drywall O, said we envision geopolitical shit like a game of Risk, and that steals our souls. One of the headlines that I read earlier today, I don't have the actual stat, but so people who don't know where Ukraine is on the map are more likely to support war.
And that was so interesting, because several weeks ago there was a poll showing the exact opposite.
Really?
Which is why I've hesitated to share that one, because I think I shared the other one from a couple weeks ago where they found people who could pinpoint Ukraine on the map were more likely to support U.S. engagement. Now, granted, that was in the context of there's just a buildup, and that engagement just means, whatever. I think they were polling about both U.S. troops and like general defensive aid to Ukraine. And so maybe sentiments just changed, different polling sizes. But the geographical ignorance of Americans is something, it's somewhat of a trope. It's granted overblown sometimes, but it is very, very prevalent that people will have a very strong foreign policy take about something, like we've talked about, they know much less about than they've led themselves to believe, or even been led to believe by someone else that they are an expert because they listened to an expert.
Yeah, and that could have been an edited post too. I didn't actually look up the article to see if it was a.
No, I saw the same one, and that's where I noted it, because it was literally the opposite of an article that I had previously seen here. And that's where, from Ron Paul's, liberty defined at the A to Z thing, I think there's a section on statistics that essentially summarizes to like, statistics are as manipulable as anything out there, like any other information. The one, I'm not a formally trained journalist. I only took one journalism class ever in university, and it was numbers as news. The point was about how statistics are so manipulable and variable in how you use them in the news, depending on what outcome you'd like. And the point was, I thought, to be skeptical of stats and news that you see, but people could very much take like a evil positive message out of the course about how manipulable stats are in the news. Beauty in the eye of the beholder, I guess.
To kind of start to wrap up, I was just wondering what you think, or how you think we did in the previous podcast, and how that aged, because, and I know that you actually didn't make this mistake, but a lot of libertarians made the mistake in saying that the United States government was wrong about Russia invading. I mean, I think it became like a reflex, right? That they say that Russia's going to invade. Obviously, this is some propaganda to like try to justify or try to have a pretext to go to war with Russia. Like that's, I mean, throughout history, throughout the information I know about our wars in the Middle East and everything like that, it just became like a reflexive thing for me. It's like, obviously they're making things up here. And now, I mean, it looks like they're right, but then because we made that one mistake, almost people are less likely to trust us about everything else, which is still right. And I believe that the United States still has been very aggressive, and though Putin is very much responsible for everything that happened yesterday, the United States have been aggressive since the 90s, and we can't say that we're not responsible for that.
Yeah. On our podcast from like 2 weeks ago, I'd say the aged incredibly well. It's a lot of the same background information we talked here. Slightly different deep dives on some things, didn't cover some of the things we covered now. So take a listen to it if you want, especially the first 2/3 or so of the podcast, 3/4. And at the end, we talked about predictions. And I did say my optimistic hope is that we don't see a full-blown invasion. I said if I had to bet my money on it, I wouldn't bet on one. Clearly, that was wrong. I think caveated with the possibility this could age like milk literally overnight. It aged like milk for 2 weeks, which I think is pretty standard for milk. So I'll take it where I can. But once again, I do just try and speak optimism into the world too in a strange manifestation kind of way where I really truly believe the more people consciously and subconsciously give themselves to negative possibilities, the more likely they are. But I also said, I believe in that podcast, that I don't expect a full-blown run over of Ukraine or a blitzkrieg style takeover of 100% of the territory. I do think the military operations will be relatively targeted. I think they're specific and planned out. I don't think it's as simple as steamrolling a country. Like we've seen, it's been largely targeted strikes on military infrastructure, on important pieces of comms equipment and the like. So we could still see a full-blown war. Like I said, worst case scenario here, we could have global thermonuclear warfare, but that's a relatively bleak and unlikely picture, I would still say, despite recent developments. The best way to describe that buildup, especially in hindsight, was that whole buildup was meta-ironic. And this is really a crazy thing and very distinct. But it was a meta-ironic invasion in that the sincerity of it was completely unknown to Russia and the West, right? I don't think Putin began necessarily the buildup explicitly knowing, thinking, being determined to launch an invasion. Meta-irony is often used to test the waters, to put yourself into a different subjective frame than you're used to test both others' reactions to it and your own. And so in a sense, I think the buildup was meta-ironic. I think it was largely testing waters, maybe trying to provoke or bait a response, seeing what that response would be, seeing how the Kremlin and the Russian people feel in that stage. And somewhere along the lines, a decision was made. Maybe it was made from the get-go, but I tend not to think that way. And that they felt comfortable in that position. They saw something. They saw some, gap in the Western armor. They saw something about the response they either didn't like or they really liked, something that compelled them to move that state of meta-ironic military buildup to sincere military invasion. I think was a pretty active change on their part. Yes, my prediction about it, although not entirely incorrect, was somewhat incorrect and did age poorly. But with any luck, my optimistic take now will not.
Yeah, well, I mean, the last thing that I got updated on was that Russia is headed towards Kiev. I don't know what's come of that, and I don't know if you have had any updates, but if either of you want to make some final comments, if you have anything, you can say them, and then we can have him have the final comment. Cool. Do you have anything else you want to say? And
man, we've covered a lot. Let me try and formulate a really strong conclusion here for us, though. In summary, this whole thing is far more complex than it would seem on the surface, especially with people being first introduced to this topic. There is work to be done as a Western mind to understand the Russian perspective in whole. And from a Russian perspective, it would take some work to understand ours as well. And I hope that through our conversation, we've kind of illuminated both of those positions in a way that is not always presented in the media. In fact, very rarely presented like that in the media. I would encourage people to be skeptical but not paralyzed, to be humble both in what we can achieve, how we can approach this, and the information that they are processing. I think we're on the precipice of a great change in the world order. I think that this is going to be prompted by great periods of self-reflection, great periods of decision-making about what kind of meta-narratives we would like to see built here as the world that we knew in the late 20th and early 21st century kind of dissolves. And our duty is to just have conversations like this more, because policymakers are at the negotiating tables, they're writing up sanctions. And so it just has to be regular people like us to do the really nitty-gritty work, I guess, and try and actually understand this and make substantive long-term change, or at least try and orally manifest it into a greater possibility of existence.
Awesome. Well, we will finish with that. Everyone who tuned in, remember to subscribe to me on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, all of the other podcatchers, and actually go over to Odyssey. Download Odyssey if you don't have it. Make an account and subscribe to me there and everyone else you follow. It's a very important project, decentralized, based in cryptocurrency or the blockchain. So you own all of your content on Odyssey. And I will be uploading this to Apple Podcast, but it won't be today. It'll come out tomorrow. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and we're likely going to do future stuff like this in the future. Thank you.